It was a Sunday night service in the Reedley MB Church. As a 13-year-old, I knew that this was going to be a different service. The church was assembled to deal with the question of different and new Bible translations. Could we use another translation of the Bible other than the one we were using, which was the King James Version? I quickly understood that this was a big deal by the heated exchange that took place. A member who was a customer of my father's farm gasoline delivery business stood up to defend the King James translation. He said that this translation was the only one that was faithful to God's word. He went on to say that God himself had warned against adding or subtracting to God's word, and this new translation was guilty of doing so. I was puzzled by the conviction and the authority with which he spoke, knowing that he was a customer my father had talked about. My folks had referred to his poor judgment on matters of farming and not paying his bills on time. I thought that someone should be able to answer this question. After all, we were the largest church in town. I think I had heard that we were also the largest MV church in the United States. Surely a question like this would be answered by our pastor, Reverend J.B. Taves, who was the unquestioned authority as far as I was concerned. The Reedley Church was eventually torn down, and my folks rescued this single frame of the impressive church windows. The church eventually permitted other translations, but reluctantly. I was comforted in knowing that we had spiritually qualified men who would guide us. Several years later, another issue arose that required the wisdom of the church. This had to do with the acceptance of television in our homes. I don't recall any Sunday night meetings at church to determine what we should do, but it became clear that individual church members were making this decision on their own. Your decision required a television antenna on the roof of your house. I remember driving with eyes focused on roofs to see which families had made this public announcement of a television on their premises. I do recall that when one of our esteemed deacons placed the TV antenna on his roof, it became clear that the church, and presumably God, had said that owning the television was okay. We all carry them today. And with a button, we can bring up approximately 40 to 50 different translations. Times have changed. The Reedley MB Church windows were one proof to me as a 13-year-old that our church was special. The beauty of the windows, the music, the careful adherence to dress and behavior were evidence that I was in a safe place with God and with man. I was a farm kid living on Road 56 among 20 other small farms of 20 to 40 acres, mostly occupied by fellow church members, many who were relatives. I attended Windsor Elementary School, a country school, the same one my mother had attended, with many of the same kids from the church. Family, school, and church were foundational to my safe world, where all three supported the same message involving matters of faith and life. 10 years later, having graduated from Tabor College, I moved to Fresno for a Christian service assignment at Pacific College. Pacific Bible Institute had just recently dropped the Bible Institute from its name. Times were changing. The MB Church youth no longer found the limited academic offerings adequate for careers in the urban world. Farm kids were moving into the city, and missionary work, while important, now required advanced degrees in subjects acceptable to the new emerging international realities. The times were changing. The changing 1960s culture added fuel to a tinderbox of discontents regarding faith and church. Faith questions were no longer about smoking, drinking, and movie attendance. They were now about militarism, racism, economic justice. U.S. foreign policy to end the evil of communism, San Francisco's Hate Ashbury Street, which is promoting free love. The Beatles sang, but they didn't sing Bach. White privilege was threatened at every level, and the suburbs were the escape route for middle-class folks looking for physical and cultural safety. I was single and naive on most political and theological issues. I found the conservative political and theological issues I had accepted in my formative years in Reedley and at Tabor College were wanting when it came to dealing with these issues with my new students. Bethany MB Church on Olive Avenue was the only Mennonite church in Fresno, and it was valiantly holding on to past dogmas, a rural outlier in the new urban reality. Roy Just was a sociology prof at City College, and in a Bethany Sunday School class, he questioned the relevancy of the old order giving the new order. What would it mean to search for new answers as followers of Christ? I was impressed by Roy and others who talked about Anabaptism and its application to the modern-day dilemmas. And many of these folks were my contemporaries at Pacific College. Most were smarter than me and had taken their biblical theology classes much more seriously. So, why am I still here? Today, Willow Avenue Mennonite is my home. Here are the important people in my life. Here is where I sort out important faith issues. This picture of space is one, for me, of faith. Faith issues to re-examine what I believe about creation, about God, and about who I am. NASA's James Webb Telescope is parked out there at 15 million miles. It's sending pictures of galaxies forming at very near the origin of the universe. Pictures of the cosmos as it existed 13 billion years ago. Those specks of light are not individual stars like our sun. They are entire galaxies. The galaxy that we know best, our own Milky Way, contains anywhere from 100 billion to 400 billion stars. The creation story of my youth had been worked out into a 7-day event with 2 individuals planted to begin the human race. The idea of 7 days and Earth being approximately 5,000 years old, as I was taught, needed to be questioned. Who, what kind of a God could have done this? And what does it mean? With the latest pictures, there is no indication of a physical heaven so far. So each new generation needs to examine the dogmas of belief that have been handed to them. Since Reedley MB had settled the question of biblical translation and TV for me, I was now moving on to other questions. And Willow Avenue Mennonite is a safe place to wrestle with these other questions about dogmas. We've already heard that Paul, in his letter to the church at Corinth, indicated that sorting out how we might live, we should think in terms of faith, hope, and love. Hope requires imagination. Hope not only of coming up with a new solution to a difficult problem, but hope of a new perspective, something that more closely fulfills the divine order. The Spanish painter Salvador Dali in this picture, The Temptation of St. Anthony, touches on the power of imagination. Whenever I think of how to think differently or how I might see things differently, I pull out this album of Dolly's paintings. This touches on the power of imagination to render perspectives of familiar objects in such a way as to invoke a new understanding or to see things a bit more clearly. Willow Avenue Mennonite has a dreamer who thinks not of how things are, but of how things might be. The Kisa Chamika and the Mama Makika House of Hope are that dreamer. The Kisa was a young Congolese exchange student at FPU when he was rendered a quadriplegic in an automobile accident. His dream had been to return home as a medical doctor. He revised that dream. He finished a PhD degree in public health from Loma Linda, but his dream was beyond that. It was big. It ignored his major health issues and his expectations. And to many of us, it seemed a bit unrealistic, the things that he was pressing for. He began a public health initiative, an Anabaptist educational initiative for primary and secondary education, and he's built a national retreat center in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. All of this while sitting in a wheelchair on Butler Avenue in Southeast Fresno, dealing with his own health and other issues. Today, he sits in the Mama Makika House of Hope in Kinshasa, engaging the next generation of Congolese youth to follow Jesus and repair what colonialism, militarism, and corruption have done to their country. Hope is the realization that everything is related to everything, and when God's people harness the good in themselves and in others, nothing basically is impossible. Love is the glue that holds all things together, the lubricant of harmony, the essence that makes palatable the human condition. According to Paul, when considering faith, hope, and love, love ends up to being the most important, our number one priority. In the past 50 years, I have known over 1,000 persons who have passed through these doors, be it CCC, MB, or now Willow Avenue. And many of those people have touched my life in multiple ways to encourage me and to carry on, and in some way I've been able to reciprocate. The picture of a harbor denotes a safe place from the churning waters of the deep, the chaos of the sea. In my 50-plus years here at Willow Avenue Mennonite, I have found this place to be a harbor from the chaotic culture of the deep that had broken, bruised, and dislocated my faith. A place to catch my breath, a place to celebrate achievements, a place to consider how things broken can be made whole again, a place of peace in the midst of storm. Where the threats and chaos of the sea are arbitrated and reconciled, the sea takes its toll in the form of injury, illness, divorce, failure, low self-esteem, abandonment, etc. It needs the embrace of a grace to set sail again. Here in my family have experienced love in that form of grace. It's come in the form of financial assistance at times when that was needed. It's come in the form of sharing and in moments of grief. And it's come in the celebration of the really good things in life. I'm still here because as a wizened old lighthouse volunteer, I relish seeing the newly outfitted eyes, arms, and feet of Jesus head into the big water to places near and far. As they head out, I encourage them to go with Amos's words. Keep it simple, just do things justly, be merciful, and be humble. That's easy to say. Pretty difficult to do at times. And so when they return, we can talk about how it all went at Audrey's Bar and Grill. You know, she's interested in those things. So I'm still here to welcome the returning, some in glory, some beat up, some for their final rest. We will inscribe their names on a bronze plaque and place their name on the wall in the memorial garden. We will remember them with all the other saints that have come and gone. I remember Werner Croker, our first pastor, who one Sunday invited my wife Arlene, who had just joined the church, to distribute the elements of the Lord's Supper. That role previously was the domain of male leadership. And that Sunday, a faith practice form was enlarged to include women. Today I acknowledge Delbert Weens, I don't know if he's here, who has carried my faith many times over the years. His friendship and his faithfulness to biblical inquiry has covered my ignorance and apathy for the biblical story. On the memorial wall is my good friend Paul Taves, who critiqued much of what I was handed by church and family regarding faith. Yet Paul and I at the same time would support each other with our deepest confessions of faith. The uncertainty of living usually produces some angst about what's transpired. Did I do enough? Did I do it well enough? And on that memorial wall now is the names of people who have accomplished that. Sometimes the harbor is bustling, other times it's quiet, but it's always there. Like a bridge over troubled water, it spans the divide of disappointment, rejection, and bitterness. This is a harbor of forgiveness and grace that's sufficient to renew our energy and to give perspective to sail again. The empowerment we derive from this is with like-minded folks who listen to us, who tolerate us, and who love us. That is why I'm still here.